Some of my most controversial videos are on art and fascism, be it anti-fascist art, art made by fascists, fascist art exhibitions, or investigations on if Dali was a fascist or not.
Painter, a fascist.
Inevitably, there are always comments from mostly right-wingers who accuse me of not knowing what fascism is. Very often, they assume that the concept of fascism can only be used as an insult. If I call Trump, Dali, or Charlie Kirk fascists, it's not because I simply disagree with them. I disagree with everyone who's not an anarchist, and I even disagree with a lot of anarchists. But it doesn't mean I think they're fascists. When I call people fascists, it's because I believe their behavior, rhetoric, or beliefs are fascistic. Some people don't know what it means, so they assume it to be an insult. So in this video, we'll clarify what fascism is. But who am I to tell you what fascism is? I'm just a YouTuber who makes videos on art. Well, another of my special interests is fascism. Not only do I read about it a lot, I also protest against it, organize against it, been on local television to denounce it.
Ça nuit non seulement à la réputation de Chandler, ça nuit à son image, puis ça nuit à la sécurité puis au vivre ensemble de la communauté.
Been threatened by local fascists who knew my address, and ironically ran for the Canadian federal elections.
Je crois sincèrement que le problème, c'est le système en soi, puis pas la personne qui est à la tête de ce système-là.
Where I often brought up the rise of fascism, to which one person got really angry at me for saying there's a rise of fascism in Quebec, and that, to say this, I probably don't know what fascism is. Well, look at me making a video about it now. But my interest for fascism didn't start with anti-fascism. Yes, I am Antifa. I should make a video about that. My interest for fascism started about a decade ago, and it wasn't oppositional. When I was 18, I changed college after only one semester, and the reasons that motivated it revealed a lot about my personality, thoughts, and politics at the time. I was a fascist. I went to a college on the rural side of Quebec because I truly believed that Quebec identity was more pure and celebrated there. I enrolled in a humanities program with a focus on Quebec studies, looking mostly at its history and its independence movement. Is it bad to defend a culture from American cultural hegemony? No, of course not. We wouldn't want humanity's rich diversity of cultures to disappear. However, there is a danger when defending a culture, especially your own, to flirt with fascism. That's what I did. I was a fascist without knowing. One of the reasons why I left Montreal, the largest city in Quebec, was because the French language, a pillar of Quebec culture, wasn't spoken enough. And often, the people who didn't speak my language or didn't share my culture also didn't share my skin color. I was very nationalistic, and though I never identified myself as a fascist, I can safely say I was one. I believed schools should instill national pride in the hearts of young Quebecois kids. I believed we should install Quebec flags at every street corner. I even believed that we should come up with some kind of government organization where you could get military-style ranks according to your devotion and knowledge of your nation. Whatever that means. I even designed fleur de lis shaped pins for different ranks. I had the golden fleur de lis. All of this was meant to create a sense of social unity based on the nation. I wanted a revolution, not one that would necessarily empower the working class, but one that would empower the members of a nation, as if a revival of pride in our collective identity would be enough to fix social problems. The rank system, by the way, was inspired by a movie I watched on the ascension of Hitler. Yeah, of course, I told myself the whole Jews thing is wrong, but the revolutionary unity and discipline around a common identity, common uniform, common party, common symbol was really appealing. Had there been a fascist party in Quebec, I would have voted for it. The idea that I might be a fascist never crossed my mind. Fascists hate minorities. They kill and commit genocides. I never wanted to do that. I didn't even hate minorities. I just thought that they were diluting national identity and killing my culture. My skepticism towards minorities wasn't hateful. It was logical, pragmatic. It was like self-defense. And there's this widespread idea that bigoted ideas are bad because they're senseless, hateful, and emotional. So when you use facts and reason, which don't care about your feelings, to justify your ideas, then your bigoted ideas are not hateful. Hate is an emotion, so if your ideas are motivated by logic and pragmatism instead of emotion, then your ideas can't, by definition, be hateful. So when someone calls you hateful, then they must be the irrational, emotional ones. I was a fascist from the age of 17 to 20. That was between 2014 and 2017. You'll never guess what radicalized me as a young white guy who loved watching YouTube in 2014.
This is part of patriarchy.
Oh, I like her. Isn't she pleasant? She seems like
The 2014 to 2016 anti-SJW alt-right pipeline has been discussed at length, so I won't go into it. Basically, what you need to know is that my devotion for my nation, my fear of the perceived threat it was facing, my rejection of social justice movements, my attraction to hierarchy, my yearning for a nationalist revolution, and the way in which I tied all of those together makes me label young Sean a fascist. The reason I'm bringing all of this up isn't only to show you that I have a personal history and interest for fascism, but more importantly, and that's what you need to remember, I was a fascist without knowing I was one, without thinking that my beliefs could be harmful. I think it helps to start looking at fascism by understanding that it doesn't grow out of evil and malevolent feelings. I think fascists genuinely believe that they're advocating for what's best for their families, communities, and nation. I understand the appeal of saying that fascists are evil. We shouldn't normalize fascism, but this makes it so that well-intentioned fascists, the ones who truly believe they're under threat by Jews or by leftists or by immigrants or some kind of enemy from within, these fascists who want to defend their nation and who truly perceive themselves as victims fighting their oppressors, as heroes and as patriots, these fascists won't see how their beliefs are harmful and therefore how their beliefs are fascistic. I think the average racist doesn't think of themselves as racist, the same way homophobic people won't think of themselves as homophobic. Many conservatives will say they're not homophobic even if they feel uncomfortable about a teacher being gay. They can also say they're not racist, but feel uncomfortable if their white daughter is dating a black man. If their white daughter. They can say they're not transphobic, but be violently against their own kids being trans. I think the reason for this dissonance is the fact that a lot of people see the terms racist, homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, and so on as insults, as a way to denigrate, and not as an accurate characterization of their beliefs. If it was accurate, it would mean that they're hateful and bigoted, which most people don't want to be, and most people don't perceive themselves as. So if I call you a fascist, a racist, a homophobe, a transphobe, or a misogynist, it isn't because I want to insult you. It's because I genuinely think that your actions or beliefs are what I call them out to be. What is to be done from there is either dismiss the input as an insult or think about why someone would call you out the way they did. They could be wrong about calling you out the way they did, but assuming it's an insult is missing on a great opportunity for introspection. But that's easier said than done. However, to think about why someone would call your actions or beliefs fascistic, you first need to recognize that you can be a fascist without knowing it, as I was, and you need to know what fascism is in the first place. That's also easier said than done. Fascism is a notoriously difficult subject to discuss and define, but I read a couple of books on the subject, and hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll be more comfortable with defining fascism and, more importantly, identifying it. Little disclaimers before going into the video. Though my interest in fascism comes from a will to fight it, this video is not a moral argument against fascism. I'm not going to go into why fascism is bad. The goal here is to understand it and identify it. I think everybody knows that fascism is bad. Most fascists don't even call themselves fascists. I think the difficulty is recognizing fascism both in others and, in some cases, in ourselves. If I really need to make a segment on why fascism is bad, I could do that segment in my video on anti-fascism if you want that video. Let me know in the comments and subscribe. Beg for the anti-fascist video. Please, Sean, make an anti-fascist video. Another important thing is that I don't want to show you scary montages of fascist rallies or parades with scary, dramatic music. Fascism loves its aesthetics of power, strength, and unity, and I don't want to play into it. Remember when teenage Sean watched a movie about Hitler's rise to power and the takeaway was, wow, community, purpose, empowerment. I don't want to do that. Also, throughout this video, I will not point to current fascist politicians or their rhetoric. I'll leave it up to you to make those connections. However, it's important to realize that there are connections to make, even if you don't believe that there is fascism in your community or society. As Roger Griffin wrote, Fascism's raw materials were such forces as militarism, racism, charismatic leadership, populist nationalism, fears that the nation or civilization as a whole was being undermined by the forces of decadence, deep anxiety about the modern age, and longings for a new era to begin, all of which are active ingredients in contemporary history. By the way, the books I used to understand fascism and explain it are Robert Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism and Roger Griffin's Nature of Fascism, two central classical books on understanding fascism. They are great references on the subject. I also read How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley, which I'll talk about later in the video. There's also this book only available in French titled Fascisme Tranquille by Jonathan Durand-Fulco, which finally motivated me to make this video. And there's, of course, Umberto Eco's Fascism. I also started reading Fascism, A Warning by Madeleine Albright. That was trash, and I didn't even finish it. I don't even have the book with me to show you. But trust me, terrible. Who would think that someone, I think Secretary of Department or something like that, would be a terrible person to talk about fascism? Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. I read every single one of them. Like and share for the algorithm boost, and subscribe if you like what you see. Also, check out my Patreon. I have a feeling this video might not be monetized. Part 1. Defining fascism. So, an answer to the question, what is fascism, would be a definition of fascism. This definition may or may not be the reason why you clicked on this video in the first place. But fascism is notoriously difficult to define, so I want to start by identifying the reasons why it's so hard to define it. Understanding these is crucial to understanding fascism in the first place. So, there are many different reasons why fascism is extremely hard to define, and I'll go into 3 of them. Fascism's ultranationalism. Firstly, and this is as close as you'll get to a consensus on the definition of fascism, because fascism is ultranationalistic, it changes from nation to nation. Because German fascism is so focused on German identity, it will greatly differ from American fascism because that fascism is so focused on American identity. Because of this, coming up with a definition that includes different fascisms from different nations and epochs when fascist movements are defined by their specific nation and epoch makes it almost impossible to do. As Paxton notes, fascism, unlike the other isms, is not for export. Each movement jealously guards its own recipe for national revival, and fascist leaders seem to feel little or no kinship with their foreign cousins. It has proved impossible to make any fascist international work. National revival, a goal shared by fascists, will have different recipes according to the historical and cultural context of the nation which seeks revival. Each fascist movement will have different scapegoats, different enemies, different rhetoric, according to what will mobilize their population. There's a wide variety and, ironically, diversity within fascism because it will mold itself to the specific characteristics of nations it tries to take over. Griffin is particularly pertinent on that point. For some, it is associated with biological conceptions of racial purity, while for others, it is simply a matter of cultural homogeneity. Some pursue aggressive policies of imperialist expansion, whereas for others, the regeneration of the nation does not involve subjugating other nations or actively persecuting ethnic minorities. The idea that, to some fascist movements, the regeneration of the nation does not involve actively persecuting ethnic minorities can be really confronting. I'm sure many scholars would disagree with Griffin on that point, but it does illustrate how there's a wide variety of fascisms and how our typical depiction of it makes it more difficult to define. Which brings us to fascism's demonization. Fascism can be hard to define because it has been demonized. Fascism is bad, of course. By demonized, I mean that we often focus on the really bad parts of fascism, which can make us forget about the other crucial, yet not as bloody, elements of fascism. Fascism, fascism, fascism. I'm going to say it so often in this video. Take a shot every time I say fascism. Very often, we focus on moments of high drama when talking about fascism, Paxton argues, and we lose sight of what fascism is. The way we narrativize it, the way we portray fascists as evil, plotting people, omits the solid texture of everyday experience and the complicity of ordinary people in the establishment and functioning of fascist regimes. Fascist movements could never grow without the help of ordinary people, even conventionally good people. In his book Fascisme Tranquille, which I absolutely adored, Jonathan Durand-Fulco warns against the tendency to believe that fascism wants destruction and genocide, that it stems from a death drive. He gives 3 arguments to avoid this amalgam. First, he says that fascists don't seek to destroy, but that destruction is an indirect consequence of what they do desire, especially in the context of total war, as we've seen in the 20th century. Second, Jean-Foucault says though there is a separation between an in-group and an out-group, which often takes the form of conflict, death and extermination isn't the only fascist solution. He gives the examples of mass deportations, closing borders, the loss of rights, laws against religious symbols, cultural assimilation, segregation, hate speech, slander, etc. You don't need to commit genocide to be a fascist. In fact, not all fascists have committed, nor have they advocated for, genocides. Why do you think Holocaust denial is so popular in neo-Nazi groups? If we're waiting for genocidal rhetoric to call fascists fascists, then we'll never be able to identify them. Thirdly, Jean-Foucault reminds us that if fascist movements were about domination, destruction, genocide, and the irrational fear of an outgroup, they wouldn't be popular. Just like many social phenomena, it's complex and based on many desires, emotions, and values, many of which are of a positive nature: desire to protect, loyalty, belonging, love of community, pride, etc. Or, to quote Ionesco in his anti-fascist play Rhinoceros, which I made a video about, where when people turn into fascists, they become rhinoceroses, his firmness was only a pose, which doesn't stop him from being a good man, of course. Good men make good rhinoceroses, unfortunately. It's because they are so good that they get taken in. These men are good only insofar as they genuinely care about the well-being of their community and are trying to fix it by bringing an alternative. They just exclude a lot of people out of this community and often entrust a leader and are fine with a police state, but they're doing it because they're stupid, not malicious. At least many of them are not. The reason why many fascists don't see themselves as fascists, or why some people have such a hard time identifying fascists, is because our mental construction of what a fascist is borderline satirical and based on an incomplete binary picture of 20th century fascism. How can my neighbor, my brother, my co-worker be a fascist if I know their intentions are good? How can they be fascists if they don't fit my perception of what an evil man looks like? I think it's important to remind ourselves that actions, behaviors, and beliefs can be bad even if their motivations come from a good place. I believe that almost none of our beliefs, including fascists, come from a bad place or from a will to hurt and destroy. If people expect modern-day fascists to wear armbands, swastikas, and do Roman salutes while raging about Jews, they might find some fascists, but they won't be able to identify a broader fascist movement in their own historical, cultural, and political context. It would be so much easier for us if there appeared on the world scene somebody saying, "I want to reopen Auschwitz. I want the black shirts to parade again in the Italian squares." Life is not that simple. Fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Too often, when trying to define and explain fascism, we point to Italian fascism or Nazism because they're the most popular and most successful examples of fascism. Both Griffin and Paxton criticize this approach, not because they're bad examples of fascism, but because these two examples can't alone represent fascism as a whole. Attempts to illuminate the dynamics of generic fascism must refrain from assuming that it is essentially the product of interwar Europe, and especially from taking Nazism as the paradigm of all structurally related movements. In this video, I won't look at the history of fascism for this reason, and because there are many great resources on that topic. Pointing to Nazis to explain what fascism is can make it harder to identify contemporary fascism. Fascism today looks pretty different from the fascism of a century ago, and solely focusing on the high drama events of a century ago can draw a one-dimensional picture of what fascism is, which, instead of helping us understand fascism, flattens it down and makes it indecipherable. Fascism's ideology. Another reason why looking at the early movements of fascism can be misleading is because, and I've seen this while doing my research, we can fall into the trap of trying to find the ideological basis of fascism through its intellectual roots. Again, Paxton and Griffin agree. Fascism is an ideology without ideas, and trying to define fascism through its original thinkers and intellectuals can be futile. An ideology without ideas comes from Thomas Mann, quoted by Paxton, who witnessed a revolution without underlying ideas, against everything nobler, better, decent, against freedom, truth, and justice. Or, as French fascist Pierre Drieux-La Rochelle wrote, quoted in Jason Stanley's book, "A fascist is a type of man who rejects culture. It is a man who does not believe in ideas and hence rejects doctrines. It is a man who only believes in acts and carries out these acts in line with a nebulous myth. To him, that was a good thing. Fascism doesn't appeal to rationality and reasoned debate. It's emotional, it's passionate, and it's through this intensity and sensation that it's able to mobilize and grab the masses' attention. Paxton identifies mobilizing passions, which we'll come back to later. While the classical isms such as conservatism, liberalism, and communism have their intellectuals, fascism doesn't. A linear pedigree that leads directly from pioneer thinkers to a finished fascism is pure invention, argues Paxton. Fascism was an affair of the gut more than of the brain, and a study of the roots of fascism that treats only the thinkers and the writers misses the most powerful impulses of all. Griffin asks a bunch of related thought-provoking questions. Then again, did fascism, if its generic existence is accepted, have a real ideology? Or is it right to say that it had the form of an ideology, but without the specific content? If it had a specific content, was this a positive one? Or basically negative, making fascism at bottom an anti-phenomenon, definable primarily in terms of what it opposes rather than what it stood for? Economic historian Karl Polanyi is quoted in the book Fascisme Tranquille for describing fascism not as a political regime, nor as a specific ideology, nor as an organized social movement, even though these elements are present in its finished form. Fascism was an ever-given political possibility, an almost instantaneous emotional reaction in every industrial community since the 1930s. One may call it a move in preference to a movement, to indicate the impersonal nature of the crisis, the symptoms of which were frequently vague and ambiguous. People often did not feel sure whether a political speech or a play, a sermon or a public parade, a metaphysics or an artistic fashion, a poem or a party program was fascist or not. There were no accepted criteria of fascism, nor did it possess conventional tenets. For Polanyi, fascism emerges when a crisis in capitalism destroys social protections and democracy becomes an obstacle to saving capitalism. We'll get back to that later. But yes, to Polanyi, fascism is more of an impulse to save capitalism than a specific ideology in the classical sense. Hopefully, I've underlined through some examples how and why defining fascism is difficult. Now, let's look at how, despite this difficulty, some have attempted to define it. What is fascism? Robert Paxton identifies three responses to the question, what is fascism? One is to deny that it has any useful meaning at all because of its sloppy usage. Paxton, funnily enough, says that if we were to drop a term for its diversity and sloppiness, liberalism would be a better candidate. For Americans, a liberal is far left, but then you have classical liberalism and neoliberalism, which are on the far right. So, as you may expect, Paxton believes that the term fascism needs to be rescued from sloppy usage, not thrown out because of it. It remains indispensable. We need a generic term for what is a general phenomenon, indeed, the most important political novelty of the 20th century, a popular movement against the left and against liberal individualism. The second way to answer what fascism is to make an encyclopedia of all the different forms of fascisms, which can be a good exercise, but not a very enlightening one for most people. The third way to answer what fascism is by constructing an ideal type that fits no case exactly, but lets us identify a kind of composite essence. Paxton is critical of this method, but that's probably the most popular way of defining fascism, and it's the one which, very famously, Roger Griffin proposed. Right off the bat, it's important to note what Griffin says about ideal types. Ideal types are simplified conceptual frameworks. No definition of any key generic term used in them can be true in the descriptive sense, but only useful. Ideal types are misused if they are treated as definitive taxonomic categories, for their value is purely heuristic. They serve not to describe or explain facts as such, but to provide tentative conceptual frameworks with which significant patterns of facts can be identified, causal relationships investigated, and phenomena classified. Ideal types are not definitions, but they're what us non-academics would call a vibe. Griffin's ideal type for fascism is the now famous fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core and its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. So let's break down this ideal type. Palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Palingenetic means born again or rebirth. It is with the particular connotations of political myth and in this radically non-restorationist sense of a new birth occurring after a period of perceived decadence that I propose to use the term palingenetic in this study. It's important to note here that the rebirth proposed by fascists is not a restorationist one, meaning they may idealize a past but don't necessarily want to revert to it. For example, Italian fascists glorified the Roman Empire but didn't want to go back to the Roman socioeconomic system or to its technology. It's more of a vibe thing. As we'll see, the proposed fascist revolution or rebirth is more of a revolution of the spirit, of national confidence and pride. It's more about the feeling of the nation regaining its pride and regaining its greatness. This can create the impression that they long to return literally to a legendary golden age, whereas such elements are being used with an essentially mythic force as the inspiration of the new order because of the eternal truths they contain for the nascent national community. As for the concept of populism, it's rooted in fascism's very particular history in the 20th century as a new form of political movement emerging at a time of mass politics. With universal suffrage and mass media, the people, with a capital P, were getting more politicized, and the only movement that spoke to them or really cared about them at all was the left. Paired with an economic crisis, the masses were growing tired of the rich and started turning to communism's anti-capitalism. Conservatives, who were mostly old rich aristocrats and bourgeois, did a terrible job at appealing to the poor masses as they didn't offer any alternative or plan to make their conditions better. Fascism was able to achieve power in Germany and in Italy because of its populism, as, in both cases, they created alliances with unpopular conservatives by giving them what they needed most. They offered fresh young faces to a public weary of an aging establishment that had made a mess of things. The two youngest parties in Italy and Germany were the communists and the fascists. Both nations longed for new leaders, and the fascists offered conservatives a fountain of youth. The fascists also offered another way of belonging, deep commitment and discipline in an era when conservatives feared dissolution of the social bond. Fascists had also found a magic formula for weaning workers away from Marxism. This magic formula was to divide the working people, not on class lines, but on national lines. The problem isn't the bourgeoisie or the economic elite, but the people who don't share your national identity. That rhetoric was very effective. Fascism could well seem to offer to the opponents of the left efficacious new techniques for controlling, managing, and channeling the nationalization of the masses. At a moment when the left threatened to enlist a majority of the population around two non-national poles, class and international pacifism. Both Paxton and Griffin insist on the fact that fascism, at least in the context of Germany and Italy, hinged on conservative collaboration. In sum, fascists offered a new recipe for governing with popular support, but without any sharing of power with the left, and without any threat to conservative social and economic privileges and political dominance. The conservatives, for their part, held the keys to the doors of power. This doesn't mean that all conservatives are fascist, nor that all conservatives would collaborate with fascists. However, historically, fascist movements have solidified and consolidated power by first creating alliances with conservatives or by infiltrating conservative parties altogether. Understanding fascism is also understanding the interests fascists and conservatives have in common. The populist element of fascism is paradoxical in the sense that it glorifies the people's will not by listening to it democratically, of course, but by embodying it and entrusting it to an elite. This elite, or the dictator, can claim to embody the popular will and thus represent it without the need to consult the people. A paradox thus lies at the heart of fascist ultranationalism. It is populist in intent and rhetoric, yet elitist in practice. Thus, even though the dictatorial or authoritarian nature of fascism isn't part of Griffin's ideal type, he says it's a pragmatic necessity if any organization is to become what its palingenetic ultranationalism dictates it must be, namely, a movement. Finally, for the nationalist part, Griffin says that the concept of nation allows for a diversity of fascist movements to be included in the ideal type because a nation can include religious, geographical, historical, constitutional, cultural, linguistic, ethnic, or genetic definitions. As for why he uses ultranationalism, I am using ultranationalism, which already has some currency in the political sciences, to refer to forms of nationalism which go beyond and hence reject anything compatible with liberal institutions or with the tradition of Enlightenment humanism which underpins them. It's important to note that within the concept of ultranationalism, there's the concept of illiberalism, which is basically the antithesis of liberalism, which is not the American definition of liberalism. Liberalism refers here to a political philosophy which espouses individual rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, plurality and protection of minority rights, democracy with free and fair elections, law, separation of powers, checks and balances, and all of that. Fascists will criticize overtly or otherwise these elements of liberalism as ones that are incompatible with the national interest, either because they promote individualism or they perceive them to threaten community, or because they believe such rights can be used to destroy the country. We did it. We defined fascism. We broke down what palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism means. So now you're good to go out in the world, identify fascism, and explain to your friends what it is. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Wait, you're not satisfied? You mean to tell me that you don't understand what fascism is, even though I explained Griffin's ideal type? I gave you the most popular, concise, and clear definition or ideal type of fascism, and it still feels unhelpful. Maybe it's helpful for scholars and political thinkers to talk about fascism with a broad ideal type that they can use as common understanding, but for the common person, this isn't that helpful. A palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, even when broken down, is still hard to identify, and when it comes to defining and understanding fascism, I feel like identifying it is the difficult but crucial part. If we want to do anything to stop fascism from taking root and spreading, if it hasn't already, we need to identify it. A palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism just doesn't cut it. I'm convinced that a definition or an ideal type isn't the most helpful way to understand and identify fascism. I'm also convinced that giving you examples from the past, such as Nazism and Italian fascism, isn't the most helpful way to identify fascism either, because fascism today won't look like the fascisms of the 30s. Durand-Foucault explains it best. According to us, the heart of fascism doesn't lie in the particular modalities of a political regime in a specific country, but in a cluster of beliefs, attitudes, and effects which circulate in a society at a particular time. What really helped me understand what fascism isn't a definition, but a list of fascist characteristics, rhetorical devices, and mobilizing passions. So part 2 of this video will be looking at exactly that. For this part of the video, I used Umberto Eco's Fascism and especially Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works. I particularly liked Stanley's book, not only because it breaks down many fascist characteristics, but also because it gives a lot of examples from worldwide contemporary fascistic movements we know little about. I greatly recommend this book. Part 2. So what is fascism really? Before going into fascist characteristics, I want to look at the context in which fascism emerges, which will provide better understanding as to why fascists adopt such characteristics. And before that, I think it's important to establish that fascism is a spectrum. Like most social phenomena, fascism is nuanced and doesn't just happen overnight. Fascism describes less a clearly finished and identifiable result than a process of radicalization going through different stages, explains Durand-Foucault. What we associate with fascism historically through Mussolini and Hitler are those fascisms which reached the final destructive stage. Yet, there are many other examples of fascisms that have developed and stagnated at earlier stages. Robert Paxton defines 5 stages of fascism. First, you have the creation of the movement, or intellectual exploration. This is a kind of proto-fascism, which is created by a small group of activists who, in the face of a perceived national decline, humiliation, or crisis, start criticizing liberal democracies, leftists, and start dreaming of a national rebirth. Second, rooting. As polarization grows, this small movement gains followers and legitimacy. They may create organizations, parties, or paramilitaries. You may even start seeing them in the media. They may also create alliances with different conservative forces or parties. Thirdly, they take power. Fascists take power either through elections, appointments, a coup, etc. This, again, is often welcomed by conservatives who see it as a way to restore order and keep leftists or liberals out of power. Fourth, exercising power. Once they're inside the state, they reshape it, suppress opposition, attack liberties, coordinate with business leaders, the police, or other military forces, and put the nation and the leader at the center of government preoccupations. The fifth stage is radicalization with a Z or a Z, or entropy. I was told that the S was the British way or the Canadian way of spelling it. So maybe spelling it with a Z is a bit more fascist because it's the American way. This is the final stage where fascism either dies as a regular dictatorship, as Mussolini did, or keeps radicalizing itself as a revolutionary movement and tries to expand through war and conducts violence and even potentially genocides. To expand on this radicalization process, Paxton is particularly enlightening. Fascist regimes could not settle down into a comfortable enjoyment of power. The charismatic leader had made dramatic promises to unify, purify, and energize his community, to save it from the flabbiness of bourgeois materialism, the confusion and corruption of democratic politics, and the contamination of alien people and cultures, to head off the threatened revolution of property with a revolution of values, to rescue the community from decadence and decline. He had offered sweeping solutions to these menaces: violence against enemies, both inside and out, the individual's total immersion in the community, the purification of blood and culture, the galvanizing enterprises of rearmament and expansionist war. He had assured his people a privileged relation with history. The reason I'm bringing up these 5 stages is to say that fascism isn't a binary. It would be wrong to say that there's either fascism or there isn't. This is why I don't like to explain fascism through a definition, which can imply that someone or a movement fits that definition or not. Now, where does fascism start in these 5 stages? Some, as I would, say that fascism starts at stage 1. Some would say that far-right, alt-right, ultranationalist conservatism are, as Foucault says, movements that slowly radicalize towards fascism without necessarily being fascist themselves. At this point, we're arguing if proto-fascists are fascist, or if the existence of proto-fascist movements is enough to say that there's fascism, whatever there's fascism means. What I want to get at is that while looking at the characteristics of fascism, which we're about to do, it's important to note that it's an accumulation of these characteristics and the intensity at which they're applicable, which, at least to me, pushes someone or a movement on either side of the fascist spectrum. Fascism grows in specific contexts, often as a reaction to different crises. Comparison suggests that fascist success in reaching power varies less with the brilliance of fascist intellectuals and the qualities of fascist chiefs than with the depth of crisis and the desperation of potential allies. There are many different reasons which can explain why fascism takes root. These help us understand why certain characteristics of fascism are important. Again, Anita Landolt Jofre in his Fascisme Tranquille breaks them down and identifies 6 of them. First, there's economic insecurity. Second, there's cultural insecurity. Thirdly, there's technology. Fourth is the crisis of democracy. Fifth is colonial violence. And because I'm afraid of losing out some space, 6th is authoritarian personality. I'll write it like this. Authoritarian. As for Griffin and Paxton, they mainly identify the crisis of economy, of culture, and of democracy as the main factors for the emergence of fascism. The crisis of economy can be observed when capitalism doesn't deliver on its promises of leisure, luxury, and comfort, when there's high job insecurity, the cost of living goes up, and when workers feel like they're getting fucked and are looking for answers. The crisis of democracy can be observed when representative democracies can't offer solutions and always seem deadlocked and incapable of addressing the multiple problems and inequalities caused by capitalism. In this case, checks and balances, debates, and law can be perceived as unnecessary hurdles to attain solutions. Like when people think that you can invade Venezuela and international law is just a hurdle to stop a dictator from being in power. Meanwhile, those barriers are to stop you from being a dictator. You personally from being a dictator. As for the crisis of culture, it can be observed when society becomes increasingly pluralistic, embracing different cultures and lifestyles, and thereby embracing an individualism where everyone can express themselves freely. This can encourage unconventional people, mostly leftists, to start very openly questioning the assumptions of tradition, making degenerate art, being queer, being decadent and different, leaving the impression that, culturally, everything is spinning out of control. Griffin elaborates on this. One of the cultural preconditions for fascism may be a diffuse sense of cultural pessimism or despair, but only in the sense that it encourages fascists to believe their movement is a panacea to the ills of the age, tackling the underlying causes of the decay of healthy values through the creation of a radically new type of national order led by a heroic elite. Fascism thus embodies a manic charge of cultural optimism, ready to swing back to pessimism if the new order does not materialize. Cultural insecurity is addressed. If you feel normal, then with fascists, you won't have to feel like you're an outsider in your own country because they won't only bring back normalcy, which means choke out diversity and pluralism, but bring the nation back to its glory days. The crisis of democracy is also addressed. If you feel like representative democracy doesn't work anymore because it's corrupt and deadlocked, fascists will purge it from corruption. Corruption to the fascist politician is really about the corruption of purity rather than of law. Officially, the fascist politicians' denunciations of corruption sound like a denunciation of political corruption, but such talk is intended to evoke corruption in the sense of the usurpation of traditional order. Masking corruption under the guise of anti-corruption is a hallmark strategy in fascist propaganda. Fascists are openly dishonest and abuse power as they don't believe in democracy and see it as a useless impediment for change. However, economically, they don't offer much. Historically at least. Indeed, most fascists, above all after they were in power, considered economic policy as only a means to achieving the more important fascist ends of unifying, energizing, and expanding the community. Historically, fascists have tried to steer away from economic issues as they opposed communists, who were pretty much only solely about economics. Fascists preferred to take the route of nationalism, identity, cultural homogeneity, and revival. Remember, it's the magic formula for weaning workers away from Marxism. Two important subpoints here. Fascism is extremely anti-leftist. Fascists and leftists have always been mortal enemies, mostly because fascism was created as a way to fight leftism. We'll see this later, but fascists have been consistently anti-intellectual, while leftists embrace intellectualism. Fascists see equality as weakness and unnatural, while leftists embrace equality. Fascists embrace nations and borders, while leftists embrace international pacifism. However, both embraced mass politics. As mentioned earlier, one necessary precondition to the emergence of fascism was mass politics. As a mass movement directed against the left, fascism could not really exist before the citizenry had become involved in politics. And to repeat Griffin's quote, fascism could well seem to offer to the opponents of the left efficacious new techniques for controlling, managing, and channeling the nationalization of the masses, at a moment when the left threatened to enlist a majority of the population around two national poles: class and international pacifism. Fascism was a response to the left's monopoly on mass politics. It's in times of economic crisis, when people get disillusioned with capitalism, that the left can offer an alternative to the suffering masses. The left was the coalition of virtually all the discontented. The left could no longer play that role in 1919 with the introduction of fascism. Fascism is the right's way of offering an alternative, though one that doesn't hurt capitalists and the economic status quo. Which brings us to the second subpoint. Fascism is capitalism in crisis. We already brought this up earlier through Polanyi, who thought that fascism is the response to the political and economic failures of capitalist democracies. The fascist solution of the impasse reached by liberal capitalism can be described as a reform of market economy achieved at the price of the extirpation of all democratic institutions, both in the industrial and in the political realm. To Polanyi, there's an inherent tension between capitalism and democracy. Capitalism, when left unchecked, is inherently incredibly destructive. It concentrates wealth, alienates people, and turns everything, even labor, into a commodity. This unrestrained capitalism, which I've heard in French be called capitalisme sauvage or savage capitalism, will create resistance in the form of what Polanyi calls counter-movement, which exercises pressure for social protections. I feel like I haven't made a joke. Do I still have your attention? These social protections would later be provided for by the state, and the state would become the stage for a tug of war between market forces, which keep wanting more profit and deregulation, and democracy, which want to keep regulating the market or even abolish it. This creates an impasse. The solution for this impasse is the death of capitalism or the death of democracy. The outright abolition of democracy was the fascist project. In Polanyi's view, it aimed to overcome society's division into economic and political spheres by subordinating politics, democracy, to the unconstrained rule of capital. In an early outline of the Great Transformation's theses, which he titled The Fascist Transformation, he drew a sharp contrast between socialism, democracy made supreme over capitalism, and fascism, which represented the restoration of capitalist power through the sacrifice of democracy. In theoretical terms, Polanyi argued that democracy was not a political regime of capitalist society. Rather, democracy and capitalism were separate systems pulling in opposite directions. Their incompatibility, he believed, was what had produced the cataclysm of the early 20th century. I sadly haven't read The Great Transformation, though it sounds fascinating. This summary of Polanyi's thoughts on fascism comes from this article in Jacobin written by Dr. Gareth Dale, who wrote like 4 books on Polanyi. I greatly recommend reading the article. Finally, to go back to the 6 roots of fascism identified by Jean Foucault, there is the authoritarian personality, which I'd like to address. This one right here. Whoa. Right here. We want to address that one. By the way, technology refers more specifically to communications technology, especially today with the internet, social media, and techno-fascism. Colonialism, or colonial violence, refers to the racial hierarchy and violence inherent to global North political cultures. There have been a lot of studies and theories to explain the psychology of fascism, or why some people seem more prone to fascism and authoritarianism than others. I've always been extremely skeptical of such claims, as I feel like they can sometimes be essentialist and sometimes point to a kind of inevitability. Inevitability. In the sense that some people are just like that. They want to dominate and destroy. It's their death pulse. However, I really liked Griffin's take on the psychology of fascism, where he presents Arthur Koestler's work. But before he does, however, he insists on bringing nuance to the idea of the psychological basis of fascism. It is important to distinguish between at least 3 types of support for a movement, that is, before a party gains power. A. The commitment of the leadership, ideologues, hardcore activists, and fanatical converts. B. The genuine but more passive and fickle commitment of rank-and-file supporters in the public at large who might be swayed by the stand it takes on a single issue, for example, immigration, communism. And C. The tactical support of those who traditionally belong to another political constituency, but who see in it a force capable of combating common enemies, for example, the left. All 3 levels of support will tend to be motivated by different considerations. Once fascism takes power and forms a regime, factors other than ideological zeal, for example, fear, opportunism, conformism, cynicism, gullibility, sadism, the effectiveness of social control, or the absence of practical alternatives, will motivate many to support or become activists in official organizations and to collude with the new regime without any intense effective commitment to its ideology or policies. Accounts of the psychological motivation for supporting fascism are only meaningful as part of an investigation into its nature if they concentrate on the most committed group of activists and converts in its movement phase, because shallowness, cynicism, and opportunism contribute to the support for all ideologies, especially in their orthodox aspect as the basis of a system. It should not be assumed that even genuine fascists understand or endorse everything contained in a fascist political program or myth. Like all carriers of an ideology, they will embody it partially and idiosyncratically, giving emphasis to different strands or potentials within it in a way which reflects their unique personality and circumstances. These are important nuances not just to understand the psychological basis of fascism, but also to understand that someone can support fascists without necessarily adhering to their ideology. My approach to the question of fascism's psychological preconditions, Griffin adds, focuses on the inner motivation of those who show a strong ideological commitment to fascism rather than on its more opportunistic or passive fellow travelers. That being said, Koestler argued that we have 2 basic drives: self-assertiveness and self-transcendence. Self-trans. It's an S. It's a C, I mean. It's a C, and that's not a British or American confusion. That's just me being stupid. One makes us want to be autonomous individuals, and the other makes us want to belong to a collective bigger than ourselves. What we strive for is delicate balance of the two drives, which allows people to experience themselves simultaneously as unique, independent personalities and as integral parts of larger social entities, both equally vital for the continued dynamism and cohesion of all human societies. He claims that we can be pathologically obsessed with one or the other of these drives, which in either case isn't good, but to be obsessed with self-transcendence is to open the door to perpetrators of inhuman deeds, to act not on their own behalf, but as subordinate parts of a hierarchy, whether human or metaphysical, which absolves them of personal responsibility and invests their actions with the sense of fulfilling a higher purpose or mission. Now, the drive for self-transcendence will increase as we increasingly feel isolated and alienated from our communities. Genuine, effective commitment to modern political ideologies, whichever they may be, from far left to far right, is a response to the drive for self-transcendence, either by looking for community in those political groups or by seeking to diminish modernity's alienating hyper-individualism. Griffin mentions sociologist Emil Durkheim and the unsustainability of individual human existence without collective myths and goals. A concomitant of the decay of Christianity was the growth of anomie, creating in individuals a sense of rootlessness and isolation which could drive them to despair and suicide. The problem of civilized man was that he still had the psychological needs of social man. The commitment to an ideology or political movement in itself isn't a problem. It's a way for us to restore balance between the need for self-assertiveness and self-transcendence when there seems to be a severe rootlessness and isolation. However, what distinguishes the content and consequences of that commitment is first, whether the ideology encourages integration, the retention of individuality, critical distance, humanity, or identification, blind obedience, fanaticism, suppression of individual conscience, and second, what the precise mythic object of integration or identification is. I'll write it down. So there's two types of ideologies, some that encourage integration and some which encourage identification. Liberalism is an integrative ideology in the sense that it is encouraged to keep your individuality and be critical. Griffin says that communism is integrative as well, though some iterations of it, for example Stalinism, aren't. You can integrate these ideologies while keeping your individuality. With Stalinism and fascism, you need to suppress this individuality to identify with the movement. In the case of fascism, its core myth of the regenerated national community led by a revolutionary elite calls a priori for an act of identification, a neurologically based mischanneling of the human drive for self-transcendence. By looking at the psychological basis for fascism proposed by Griffin, fascism gains popularity by answering to one of our fundamental needs, the need for self-transcendence, the need for community, the need to be part of something bigger than ourselves. However, it demands in return the abdication of self-assertiveness. Fascist traits. Knowing what type of anxiety fascism responds to helps us understand why their solutions mobilize a specific electorate. Their solutions, their traits or characteristics, are taken here from three different thinkers on the topic of fascism: Umberto Eco, Jason Stanley, and Robert Paxton. If you looked up what fascism meant, you probably came across Umberto Eco's 1995 Fascism, a very short read which I'll link in the description. In this text, he identifies 14 characteristics of fascism: cult of tradition, rejection of modernism, cult of action for action's sake, disagreement is treason, fear of difference, appeal to a frustrated middle class, obsession with a plot, enemies are too strong and too weak, anti-pacifism, contempt for the weak, cult of death, machismo, selective populism, and newspeak. If you liked reading Umberto Eco's Fascism and you want more because it's really short, Jason Stanley's 2018 How Fascism Works is an incredible book that I recommend you read next. Each fascist trait is given a full chapter to be explained. These chapters are Mythic Past, where he also goes into misogyny, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, rural-urban divide, and hard labor as reform. Finally, we have Robert Paxton's 9 mobilizing passions from his 2004 book, Anatomy of Fascism, which we've already quoted in this video. Overwhelming crisis, primacy of the group. That's a U, by the way. Just so that you don't think I'm that stupid. Victimhood, perceived decline, need for pure community, need for authority, leaders' instincts over reason, beauty of violence, and right to dominate. We won't go into every trait listed here, as it would both be too long and many of them overlap. What we will do is group them thematically into 3 families and introduce them that way. Firstly, there's Mythic Past and identity. The Mythic Past is the concept I personally associate with fascism the most, as I believe it's at the roots of fascist movements. Both Umberto Eco and Jason Stanley identify this specific element first and foremost in their work. Roger Griffin's palingenesis is a direct reference to the mythic past fascists use, not as a goal, but as an aspiration. If you remember, fascists don't want to bring us back to a moment in time, they want to bring us back to the perceived greatness of that moment in time, which is why the past is mythological. Stanley describes the mythic past as follows. Fascist politics invokes a pure mythic past tragically destroyed. Depending on how the nation is defined, the mythic past may be religiously pure, racially pure, culturally pure, or all of the above. This is echoed in both Paxton's perceived decline, or dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences, and need for purer community, or the need for closer integration of a pure community by consent if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. We have created our myth. The myth is a faith, a passion. It is not necessary for it to be a reality. Our myth is the nation. Our myth is the greatness of the nation. And to this myth, this greatness, which we want to translate into a total reality, we subordinate everything. This quote by Mussolini sums it up best, openly stating that the myth does not need to be a reality. It just needs to be a unifying narrative, one that the people can subordinate everything to. Umberto Eco brings up how the fascist cult of tradition isn't based in reality. Fascist tradition, to Eco, is syncretic. It's a collection of myths, symbols, national histories, and cultural cliches which may contradict each other. But why exactly is a mythic past a feature so important to fascist ideas? As mentioned earlier, it's a unifying myth. People can get behind the nostalgia of a glorious past and want to make their nation great again. The way this greatness will be restored is of second order, but the unity that this nostalgia provides is important. Who exactly can get behind the nostalgia of a glorious past? If we take the United States, for example, will immigrants feel this nostalgia for the glorious past of a nation they just integrated? Will indigenous people, black people, or queer people feel unified behind the mythic past of a nation that excluded them? Not only excluded them narratively, but physically through slavery, segregation, or even genocide. Speaking of which, the mythic past is mythic, not only because it's an idealization of the past, but also because the invention of a glorious past includes the erasure of inconvenient realities. While fascist politics fetishizes the past, it is never the actual past that is fetishized. These invented histories also diminish or entirely extinguish the nation's past sins. When it does not simply invent a past to weaponize the emotion of nostalgia, fascist politics cherry-picks the past, avoiding anything that would diminish unreflective adulation of the nation's glory. Aside from being unifying for a majority through nostalgia, the mythic past also justifies many different hierarchies which are essential to fascists. When the mythic past has been established as the source for truth and as an aspiration to the nation's greatness, any deviation from the truth provided by this mythic past is perceived as a betrayal to the nation. This past traces the future path of the nation, its destiny, so anyone who wants to deviate from that path is a traitor, as identified by Eco's fourth point, disagreement is treason. Which brings us to Umberto Eco's second point, the rejection of modernism, in which he says that although fascists embrace technology, they reject modernism in a very specific way. Fascism is disguised as a rebuttal of the capitalist way of life, but it mainly concerned the rejection of the spirit of 1789 and of 1776, of course. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Rationality is seen as the enemy of the myth and the passions fascists try to produce, because rationality is dialogue, it's progress, leaving behind the tradition that we deem unnecessary or harmful. Fascism isn't only irrational, but illiberal. We can turn to Jason Stanley to explain how, in the context of a tragically destroyed mythic past, such a glorious past has been lost by the humiliation brought on by globalism, liberal cosmopolitanism, and respect for universal values such as equality. These values are supposed to have made the nation weak in the face of real and threatening challenges to the nation's existence. How do the ideas of liberty and equality espoused by liberalism make the nation weak according to fascists? Robert Paxton says that fascists claimed that the division and decline of their communities had been caused by electoral politics and especially by the left's preparations for class warfare and proletarian dictatorship. We are too divided, too polarized, and what we need to bring us back together is to oust the elements which allow us to be divided: liberty and equality. Communities had to be unified by state action, using persuasion and organization if possible, using force if necessary. Actually, I'm going to circle them. I feel like this makes it more clear. People having different opinions, especially when they diverge from the nation's destiny as determined by its mythic past, and people wanting equality, especially when that means attacking the bourgeoisie, split the nation and ultimately harms it. This is the fifth characteristic of fascism according to Eco: fear of difference. Fascism grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. All this to say, the mythic past is a pillar of fascist ideas as it's used as a way to unify and mobilize a specific segment of the population, while rejecting others. The process of unification through identity and nostalgia is paired with a rejection of the ideas which undermine consensus, such as freedom and equality. The example I used to illustrate why fascists see equality as weakness is in the disunity creates through class warfare. If the working class fights the rich elite, then there is infighting in the country, which isn't good. We mentioned earlier the fact that communists believed that the workers of the world should unite on class rather than divide itself on nation. But there are also other reasons why fascists don't like equality. What are those reasons, Sean? Please tell us. We could go into social Darwinism and how fascists apply the competitive, individualistic logic of survival of the fittest to our social relations, believing that it justifies hierarchy within society. This is something the anarchist Peter Kropotkin refuted, believing that cooperation, rather than competition, is what allowed humans and other species to thrive. He's right. However, I'd rather delve deeper into another example of how fascists perceive equality and freedom as a destabilizing and weakening factor of modernity. And this example is identified by both Umberto Eco and Jason Stanley. This example is patriarchy and anti-feminism. In all fascist mythic pasts, an extreme version of the patriarchal family reigns supreme. In the same chapter where he explains the mythic past, Jason Stanley goes into how important patriarchy is to fascists. Patriarchy, the idea that men should have authority and power, means rule of the father in Greek. That is important because to fascists, patriarchy in the family, which to them is natural, can be mirrored on the level of the nation. In a fascist society, the leader of the nation is analogous to the father in the traditional patriarchal family. The leader provides for his nation, just as in the traditional family, the father is the provider. The patriarchal father's authority derives from his strength, and strength is the chief authoritarian value. By representing the nation's past as one with a patriarchal family structure, fascist politics connects nostalgia to a central organizing hierarchical authoritarian structure, one that finds its purest representation in these norms. In fascist politics, myths of a patriarchal past, threatened by encroaching liberal ideals and all that they entail, function to create a sense of panic at the loss of hierarchical status, both for men and for the dominant group's ability to protect its purity and status from foreign encroachment. Without strength and authority, how can a man, a father, protect his children from threats? Without strength and authority, how can a man, a leader, protect his nation from threats? Oh, riddle me that, liberals. Traditionally, men will find value in having the strength to protect and provide for their family. Now, if women can go to university and find jobs and provide for their families, if women also have strength by creating political groups which advocate for their rights, then that devalues men. What's the point of being a man if a woman can do everything he can? Jason Stanley's 8th chapter is titled Sexual Anxiety, and it goes deeper into this phenomenon. Patriarchy doesn't only imply that power and authority stay in the hands of men, but it also requires strict and rigid gender boundaries and gender roles. He cites Julia Serrano, author of the book Whipping Girl. In a male-centered gender hierarchy, where it is assumed that men are better than women and that masculinity is superior to femininity, there is no greater perceived threat than the existence of trans women, who, despite being male and inheriting male privilege, choose to be female instead. By embracing our own femaleness and femininity, we, in a sense, cast a shadow of doubt over the supposed supremacy of maleness and masculinity. In order to lessen the threat we pose to the male-centered gender hierarchy, our culture, primarily via the media, uses every tactic in its arsenal of traditional sexism to dismiss us. He then analyzes the politics of sexual anxiety, or as I see it, male insecurity, and he does it so incisively that I'll just quote the whole thing. By employing the politics of sexual anxiety, a political leader represents, albeit indirectly, freedom and equality as threats. The expression of gender identity or sexual preference is an exercise of freedom. By presenting homosexuals or transgender women as a threat to women and children, and by extension to men's ability to protect them, fascist politics impugns the liberal ideal of freedom. A woman's right to have an abortion is also an exercise of freedom. By representing abortion as a threat to children and to men's control over them, fascist politics impugns the liberal ideal of freedom. The politics of sexual anxiety also undermines equality. When equality is granted to women, the role of men as sole providers for their families is threatened. Highlighting male helplessness in the face of sexual threats to their wives and children accentuates such feelings of anxiety at the loss of patriarchal masculinity. The politics of sexual anxiety is a powerful way to present freedom and equality as fundamental threats without explicitly appearing to reject them. A robust presence of a politics of sexual anxiety is perhaps the most vivid sign of the erosion of liberal democracy. To steer away from patriarchy and anti-feminism, there is also the idea that freedom and equality are the bedrock of multiculturalism, which fascists see as a threat to the nation. With the freedom to practice the religion or culture you want, for example, and the equality of treatment and opportunities for everybody regardless of ethnicity or nationality or religion, it's easy to see how the values of freedom and equality become threats in themselves. Finally, Jason Stanley has a chapter titled Sodom and Gomorrah, which I expected it to be on homosexuality, but which is actually on the rural-urban divide. This chapter particularly echoed with me as I lived in a rural area for way too long, and I'm sure some of you who have will also sympathize. Stanley explains that fascists idealize rural villages and demonize urban centers. The rural village is the cradle of traditional life. Families are bigger, women can stay at home, communities are more culturally, religiously, and racially homogenous, traditions are respected, there's less violence, and there's more social control. The rigidity and homogeneity of rural villages, anchored in traditional lifestyles and traditional values, are used as models for fascists. Urban centers, on the other hand, are where you see declining birth rates, emancipated women, protests and division, racial, cultural, and religious diversity, which encourages more tolerance for differences, and even race mixing. Ooh, race mixing is communism. There's also more violence. Fascists love to overemphasize urban violence to crack down on cities. In urban centers, there's more decadence. The use of the word degenerate is often used in fascist rhetoric to talk about the moral decay and corruption of cities. This degeneracy is characterized by sexual practices that aren't heterosexual and identities that aren't cis. It's also characterized by certain modern art practices which fascists hate and which they call degenerate. Think of Hitler's degenerate art exhibition of 1937. Finally, despite urban areas being the economic hub of their region, they're still perceived as filled with parasites who are often minorities, who don't work and who steal hard-earned rural workers' tax money. Alright, so we made an overview of fascism's mythic past and its importance, the traditions it defends, its rejection of freedom and equality, the central role that patriarchy plays not only as a way to justify authority, but also to empower an insecure male electorate, and finally looked at how all of this was embodied in an idealized rural lifestyle placed in opposition with a demonized, degenerate urban lifestyle. The Other. The subtitle to Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, is The Politics of Us and Them. This division is eloquently explained in his chapter, Law and Order, where he opens by talking about the Central Park Five, a 1989 case where 5 Black and Hispanic teenagers were arrested for allegedly committing a gang rape in Central Park. Donald Trump publicly called for their execution. The Central Park Five were innocent. Added to that, in 2016, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions said that Trump's call for executions showed his dedication to law and order. This is a striking understanding of law and order, not only because the teenagers were, in fact, completely innocent, but because Trump's words left no room for due process in the case. I would add that if the Central Park Five had been executed, even with due process, it would have remained illegal, as New York's last death penalty law was invalidated in 1985 by its Court of Appeals. Executing 5 innocent men in a state where executions aren't legal is quite unlawful. So, why are fascists calling it a commitment to law and order? Fascist law and order rhetoric is explicitly meant to divide citizens into 2 classes: those of the chosen nation who are lawful by nature, and those who are not, who are inherently lawless. In fascist politics, women who do not fit traditional gender roles, non-whites, homosexuals, immigrants, decadent cosmopolitans, those who do not have the dominant religion, are in their very existence violations of law and order. And this is where I come in with my favorite TikTok video of 2025. It was made by Jason K. Pargan, and in it, he breaks down the resentment at the root of this boomer meme.
This boomer comic has been making the rounds on Facebook for at least a decade, and it portrays a brave older Marine in a coffee shop where the barista says, "Can I interest you in a soy latte?" He says, "No, just coffee, black." Caramel macchiato? Just coffee, black. Iced peppermint mocha? Just coffee, black. Frappe? Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this scenario has never occurred once anywhere in the history of the world. And if you say, well, yeah, but it's just a joke, I'm saying the thing that it's exaggerating has never occurred. But the perception of the world that caused the artist to create this and motivated people to share this millions of times is incredibly important. Because in reality, no one ever took his black coffee from him. Every shop like this has black coffee. He can also get it at any gas station or any McDonald's drive-thru or from home. All that happened is the range of options for other people expanded, and he perceived that as persecution, as his choice having been taken away. This is not political. This is a human nature thing. Most people are not satisfied to simply have the option to live their life the way they want. They also want to feel normal. They want to walk around and see that most other people have made the same choice they made. And if over time they see that their own personal preference has become less popular and even worse, is now seen as being basic or unsophisticated, they will perceive the mere existence of those other options as a criticism of them, even if they've never heard anybody voice that criticism. This is why it's so important for some people to imagine the archetype of the angry vegan. Even though, 1, I have never run into one of those people in real life, not even once. And 2, meat statistically is more popular now than it has ever been in the history of the world. There is basic psychological comfort in knowing that you're conforming to what the world wants and in the reassurance that that world is not going to change. And this is why it doesn't help to simply tell people you can keep doing the thing you were doing. No one's stopping you from drinking your coffee. Because it's not about the coffee. It's the fear that if everybody else stops drinking coffee the way I drink it, then I will become an outcast. And that is scary to someone who suddenly is remembering how they have always treated outcasts.
The reason why I love this video so much is because it introduces 2 concepts which I believe are incredibly important to understand fascism: normalcy and victimhood. Normalcy, for philosopher Michel Foucault, serves as a mechanism of social control, using norms to encourage conformity. Fascists see norms, or what is normal, as natural. Traditional gender roles, heterosexuality, and wanting less racial, religious, or cultural diversity is natural. It's normal. We already talked about using our perception of what's natural as a way to justify domination by mentioning social Darwinism, but they also use it to justify hierarchy. Their principal justification of hierarchy is nature itself. For the fascist, the principle of equality is a denial of natural law, which sets certain traditions, those of the more powerful, over others. The natural law allegedly places men over women and members of the chosen nation of the fascist over other groupings. And very importantly, when defining the other, you need to determine what is normal and have it opposed to what is not normal. What isn't normal is undesirable. It's what doesn't conform to the norms established by society or even established by nature. The concept of degeneracy is important to fascists because it adds moral value to what is normal and what isn't. What isn't normal transgresses the social order or the natural order of things. It can be seen as an affront, something to at best tolerate or at worst repress. The concept of law and order doesn't really refer to the respect of laws and the Constitution, of course not, but more as a way to distinguish and target the undesirable, the one that brings disorder, the one that doesn't conform, the other. And as the boomer meme indicates, conforming to what's normal feels safe, it's comfortable, and as people adhere less and less to the norm, the less comfortable and safe you feel with just following. You may now have to be confronted with having to choose between a bunch of coffee options, dietary options, or a bunch of genders and pronouns and sexual identities. This can make you feel uncomfortable because while others have thought about the choices they've made, you have simply conformed to the norm, and though you may have actually thought about it and you really do just want a black coffee, you look less refined, less individuated. You may feel, as Pargan notes, judged for being normal, even though nobody has judged you. You feel judged. That's the important part. That's why I believe so many people get annoyed or even angry at vegans, who apparently will yell at you if you eat meat, or at trans people, who apparently will yell at you if you accidentally misgender them, even though they've never been yelled at by either. It's easy to feel oppressed without having experienced oppression. We've all heard at least one insecure straight white man say that straight white men are the true victims of oppression nowadays. Which brings us to victimhood. In fascist politics, the opposing notions of equality and discrimination get mixed up with each other. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 made the newly emancipated Black Americans of the South into U.S. citizens and protected their civil rights. It was passed on the Senate and the House on March 14, 1866. Later that month, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act on the grounds that this law establishes for the security of the colored race safeguards which go infinitely beyond any that the general government have ever provided for the white race. As W.E.B. Du Bois notes, Johnson perceived minimal safeguards as the start of a path toward future black equality as discrimination against the white race. In other words, the fascist rhetoric is to frame the people who demand equality as people who want to discriminate against the majority. My favorite part of Jason K. Pargan's boomer meme analysis is how it shows that people in a position of domination, or at least those who conform to the norm, in this case old black coffee drinkers, frame themselves in a victimary position by imagining scenarios in which they are the victims. Again, the person making this meme imagined not having his choice respected, of being mistreated, I guess, or even discriminated against. We've talked about people who've never spoken to trans people in their lives, yet believe that an accidental misgendering will get them yelled at or canceled. Or 10 years ago, people who hated blue-haired feminists thought that they weren't approachable because they'd get triggered by you being a white guy. I was that white guy. Do these people exist? Probably, but often this imagined victimary position is the result of memes and online videos rather than actual lived experiences. And notice how the oppressors in these imagined victimary scenarios are very often minorities. But to fascists, it doesn't matter if the oppression experienced is real or not. All that matters is if it can mobilize the electorate. Umberto Eco, Jason Stanley, and Robert Paxton all identify victimhood as an important characteristic of fascism. Paxton is perhaps the most salient by defining it as one of his 9 mobilizing passions. The belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external. It's important for fascists to frame themselves as victims in order to justify violent repression against the other. To mobilize your followers, you must convince them that your culture, your nation, your language, your race, your traditions are under attack. And such attacks are never systemic. They never come from an abstract concept or system. They come from a clearly identifiable group. It's people, not systems, from a minority group. Either that minority is religious, ethnic, or leftists. It's often leftists, since leftists are anti-fascists. It's often all of those, actually. Nationalism is at the core of fascism. The fascist leader employs a sense of collective victimhood to create a sense of group identity that is, by its nature, opposed to the cosmopolitan ethos and individualism of liberal democracy. The group identity can be variously based on skin color, on religion, on tradition, on ethnic origin, but it is always contrasted with a perceived other against whom the nation is to be defined. Fascist nationalism creates a dangerous them to guard against, at times to battle with, to control, in order to restore group dignity. Eco frames it more specifically in terms of a plot in his 7th characteristic. The followers must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve the plot is the appeal to xenophobia. But the plot must also come from the inside. Jews are usually the best target because they have the advantage of being, at the same time, inside and outside. The other needs to be an outsider, obviously, but it also needs to be an insider. An outsider to consolidate our identity, this separation between us and them. An insider, or an enemy from within, to justify taking over the state and suspending liberties to snuff out those enemies. This paradoxical double nature of the other, or the enemy, is also shown in Eco's 8th point. Wait, I wanted to change colors for the other. Sorry about that. Sorry for the confusion. I'm getting a little tired. So victimhood is actually in blue. That way we can differentiate the different families. Law and order. Obsession with a plot. Is this better? Yeah, I think this is better. Is it better? All right, so this paradoxical double nature of the other or the enemy is also shown in Eco's 8th point. The enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. The other is rich, powerful, controls Hollywood and universities, but the other is also lazy, weak, and pathetic. This echoes Eco's 10th characteristic. See what I did there? Which is contempt for the weak. This is often based on the idea of social Darwinism and the ideal of a society of pure, able-bodied, youthful citizens. In his 9th characteristic, he says that fascism sees pacifism as weakness, as life should be accepted as a constant struggle. While finally, in his 11th characteristic, he identifies fascism's cult of death, or the cult of heroism, as the logical conclusion of this struggle. The last two mobilizing passions identified by Paxton are the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will when they are devoted to the group's success, and the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, right being decided by the sole criterion of the group's prowess within a Darwinian struggle. All of this to say that with fascism, the identification of the other is essential. This other is essential to consolidate an identity opposed to it. This other is essential as a scapegoat to mobilize against, and this other is essential not only as a scapegoat, but also, perhaps more importantly, as an oppressive force to fight against. For, as Jason Stanley says, oppression is a powerful motivation for action, but the questions of who is wielding it, when, under what context, and against whom remain eternally crucial. How does one convince a whole population to be obsessed with the plot, to feel victimized, to blame it on the other, to fall for the mythic past, and to see liberty, equality, and diversity as a threat? How can fascism, as a popular movement against the left and against liberal individualism, to quote Paxton, succeed in making people look away from class differences and concentrate on national differences? How can you make people see immigrants as an enemy, but billionaires as allies? Truth. One can't talk about fascism without talking about the way in which it manipulated its followers through propaganda. It's an incredibly popular topic, and it's often described as the tool through which the powerful could convince thousands, if not millions, to support war and violent xenophobic policies. I made a whole video on propaganda by using Edward Bernays' book Propaganda if you ever want to check that out. Before writing his book on fascism, How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley wrote How Propaganda Works, which I haven't read, but which shows the overlap between these two topics. In How Fascism Works, Stanley identifies propaganda, anti-intellectualism, and unreality as characteristics of fascism which are all closely linked. In his chapter on propaganda, he most interestingly notes the use of doublespeak in fascist rhetoric. Doublespeak is a term coined by George Orwell in his book 1984, which can refer to two things. As a euphemism, like when you use words to make things look better than what they are, for example, using downsizing instead of firing a bunch of people, or as an outright inversion of meaning, such as the term freedom fighters. George Carlin is especially pertinent here.
Israeli murderers are called commandos. Arab commandos are called terrorists. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight?
Umberto Eco identifies newspeak, again from Orwell's 1984, as his last characteristic of fascism, though he identifies the impoverishment of language as a way to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. Fascists twist ideas against themselves in order to make the loss of freedom or the loss of equality seem beneficial to the people. For example, we already spoke about how fascists claim to attack corruption while being the most corrupt themselves. Corruption to the fascist politician is really about the corruption of purity rather than of law. Officially, the fascist politician's denunciations of corruption sound like a denunciation of political corruption. But such talk is intended to evoke corruption in the sense of the usurpation of traditional order. Masking corruption under the guise of anti-corruption is a hallmark strategy in fascist propaganda. In the name of rooting out corruption and supposed bias, fascist politicians attack and diminish the institutions that might otherwise check their power. Fascists also use the same twisting for the concept of freedom. They're obviously against freedom. While some countries will open their borders allowing greater freedom of movement and travel, such as you may see in the European Union, fascist countries will reinforce their borders, greatly reducing freedom of movement. They'll also very often take freedoms away from artists by not allowing them to paint, as was the case with Emil Nolde, who was himself a Nazi. I made a video about that. Or they may take away freedoms away from queer people just because they're queer, either by not allowing them to get married or by simply imprisoning them, or worse, exterminating them. These are just examples, but they don't necessarily show how ideals are used as a justification to reduce these very ideals. Stanley provides many, either by showcasing how the Confederacy used the ideal of liberty to defend the liberty to own slaves, or how it used the ideal of rights to defend states' rights and slavery, or how Hitler, because he supposedly represented the people, had democratic legitimacy to be a dictator. In the Confederacy's use of the concept of liberty to defend the practice of slavery, the Southern states' call for states' rights to defend slavery, and Hitler's presentation of dictatorial rule as democracy, liberal democratic ideals are used as a mask to undermine themselves. Fascists have always been well acquainted with this recipe for using democracy's liberties against itself. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels once declared, "This will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the means by which it was destroyed." Eco's second-to-last characteristic underlines this very point, talking about how, to fascists, the will of the people is better represented by a strong leader than by a parliament. Wherever a politician casts doubt on the legitimacy of a parliament because it no longer represents the voice of the people, we can smell fascism. From there, it's easier to understand fascism's anti-intellectual positioning, and Stanley isn't the only one mentioning it. You also find it in Eco's cult of action for action's sake, which I'll quote from. Culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. Distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of fascism, from Goering's alleged statement, "When I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun," to the frequent use of such expressions as degenerate intellectuals, eggheads, effetist snobs, universities are a nest of reds. Is it effetist snobs? Effeti? Critical thinking is the enemy of the mythic past, as it is mythic. Critical thinking is also the enemy of fascism's attempt to divide on national, ethnic, or religious lines. And critical thinking is especially the enemy of attempts at manipulation and propaganda through newspeak. Fascist politics seek to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and language. Intelligent debate is impossible without an education with access to different perspectives, a respect for expertise when one's own knowledge gives out, and a rich enough language to precisely describe reality. When education, expertise, and linguistic distinctions are undermined, there remains only power and tribal identity. That being said, Jason Stanley uses the case of the university as a way to illustrate fascism's anti-intellectualism. In fascist ideology, there's only one legitimate viewpoint, that of the dominant nation. Schools introduce students to the dominant culture and its mythic past. Education, therefore, either poses a grave threat to fascism or becomes a pillar of support for the mythical nation. It's no wonder, then, that protests and cultural clashes on campuses represent a true political battleground and receive national attention. The stakes are high. From book burnings to putting universities under party control, to changing curricula to fit the fascist narrative, to purging scholars critical of fascism, to even targeting students, universities have been, as Stanley writes, a true political battleground. One particular popular argument fascists use to fight on this political battleground is the one of free speech. Again, liberal democratic ideals are used as a mask to undermine themselves. Stanley gives the example of American universities. Given the formal protections of academic freedom, universities in the United States host the freest domain of expression of any workplace. In private workplaces in the United States, free speech is a fantasy. Workers are regularly subjected to non-disclosure agreements, forbidding them to speak about various matters. In most workplaces, workers can be fired for political speech on social media. Attacking the only workplaces in a country with genuine free speech protections using the ideal of free speech is another instance of the familiar Orwellian nature of propaganda. Often, free speech isn't the issue on university campuses. What's seen as more problematic is that universities usually are more liberal. No matter if universities are hotbeds of liberal or leftist thought, or whether that's just a moral panic, there definitely is a heavy bias between higher education and voting liberal. Whenever fascism threatens, its representatives and facilitators denounce universities and schools as sources of Marxist indoctrination, the classic boogeyman of fascist politics. Typically used without any connection to Marx or Marxism, the expression is employed in fascist politics as a way to malign equality. That is why universities that seek to give some intellectual space to marginalized perspectives, however small, are subject to denunciation as hotbeds of Marxism. Fascism is about the dominant perspective, and so, during fascist moments, there is strong support for figures to denounce disciplines that teach perspectives other than the dominant ones, such as gender studies or, in the United States, African American studies or Middle Eastern studies. The dominant perspective is often misrepresented as the truth, the real history, and any attempt to allow a space for alternative perspectives is derided as cultural Marxism. The Nazis called it cultural Bolshevism instead of cultural Marxism, but the idea is the same: to denounce universities as institutions of indoctrination. If universities are critical of the systems that perpetuate inequalities, if they become places of resistance and protests, for fascists, it isn't because thinking makes you want to fight injustice, but because universities are brainwashing students. Which brings us to Jason Stanley's fourth chapter, Unreality. When propaganda succeeds at twisting ideals against themselves and universities are undermined and condemned as sources of bias, reality itself is cast into doubt. We can't agree on truth. Fascist politics replaces reasoned debate with fear and anger. When it is successful, its audience is left with a destabilized sense of loss and a well of mistrust and anger against those who, it has been told, are responsible for this loss. He talks about a climate where we don't know what's true or not, and how, in this polarizing post-truth climate, we can't have reasonable conversations anymore, especially when people turn to conspiracy theories, whether it be cultural Marxists indoctrinating university students, galleries, and museums, or Jews controlling Hollywood, the media, and the shadow government. What happens when conspiracy theories become the coin of politics and mainstream media and educational institutions are discredited is that citizens no longer have a common reality that can serve as background for democratic deliberation. I made a video analyzing the movie Begonia on this very topic. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. The consequences of the loss of a common reality caused in part by fascists is that citizens have no choice but to look for markers to follow other than truth or reliability. What happens in such cases, as we see across the world, is that citizens look to politics for tribal identifications, for addressing personal grievances, and for entertainment. When news becomes sports, the strong man achieves a certain measure of popularity. Fascist politics transforms the news from a conduit of information and reasoned debate into a spectacle, with the strong man as the star. The strong man comes in as a savior, a champion, encouraging tribal identifications and groupthink, which brings us to three of Paxton's mobilizing passions. The primacy of the group, toward which one has duties superior to every right, whether individual or universal, and the subordination of the individual to it. The need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a national chief who, alone, is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. And the superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason. This feels like a natural way to conclude the characteristics of fascism, on its authoritarianism. The way fascists justify authoritarianism is, as we've seen, by undermining reason and trusting the leader's instincts and personal qualities. It's also done by undermining truth, criticism, and by delegitimizing the pluralist representative democracy in defense of someone who will truly defend the will of the people as a monolith. It also undermines checks and balances and the rule of law, even international law, by framing these things as barriers to dealing with enemies rather than barriers to prevent the concentration of power. We've also seen that fascists will use the very effective tool of victimhood in order to justify their oppression as self-defense. This self-defense is done by attacking enemies, the other, which, when accused of being enemies from within, justifies suppressing political opponents and, once again, concentrating power. Conclusion. Hopefully by now, you understand fascism a little better and feel more comfortable identifying it in the real world, online, in others, and in yourselves. If, like me, you are now convinced that there is fascism around you, either in its precursor elements, in its influences as a movement, or even in government, you may wonder, what do we do next? Because, yes, it's important to understand what fascism is to better identify it and to better denounce it, but it barely feels like it's enough to fight it. Take it from me, no matter how well you understand fascism, the people you talk to on the right, fascists or not, will claim that you have no idea what you're talking about. In our current political climate, talking to people on the right about these things is possible, but it's extremely difficult, and I definitely don't recommend it. However, most people aren't on the right. Most people can have an honest, open discussion on what fascism is and how it applies to movements, beliefs, institutions, and public figures. I think we'd all benefit from having these conversations and having a better collective grasp on the concept of fascism. But again, talking about fascism and understanding it doesn't prevent it from taking root, spreading, and taking power. Trust me, people in Nazi Germany knew what fascism was, and it didn't stop it from happening. I'll make a video on anti-fascism, its history, what it is, what it does, and how to join the organization Antifa. The CIA is going to love that video. I heard they love my channel already, so subscribe. However, I don't want to end this video by telling you to talk to your friends about what fascism is and wait for my next video on anti-fascism to know what to do next. In the introduction of Fascisme Tranquille, Durand-Folco quotes Albert Camus. Each generation doubtless feels called upon to reform the world. Mine knows that it will not reform it, but its task is perhaps even greater. It consists in preventing the world from destroying itself. Sometimes, as anti-fascists, which I assume you are if you're this far into this video, fascist progression backs us into a corner and makes us defend the way things were in order to prevent the world from destroying itself. We end up defending liberal democracy even though we know it's captured by billionaires. We end up voting for liberal parties out of fear of fascist gains as harm reduction. In the last Canadian federal elections, I voted for myself because I was a candidate, but I know many leftist friends who voted for a banker out of fear that Trumpist conservatives would take power in Canada. And I can't blame them. However, if our work simply consists in preventing the world from destroying itself without offering an alternative, by advocating to return to the liberal capitalism that got us to fascism in the first place, which continues to concentrate wealth and power, alienates us, and makes us miserable, then we're not going to mobilize anyone against fascism. As Durand-Foucault writes, for better or for worse, this authoritarian shift is an opportunity to profoundly reinvent our model of civilization, our institutions, our imaginaries, and our ways of life. Our historic task, therefore, presents itself as follows: to take nothing for granted anymore, not to be satisfied with merely defending what exists, and to transform this nightmare into a springboard for re-establishing a democratic society on radically new foundations. So while I work on my video on anti-fascism, I want to recommend you an anarchist FAQ, which I narrate and publish chapters of every week on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and any other platform, I think. Each chapter answers specific questions on anarchism, from what is anarchism to is capitalism based on freedom, and what are some examples of anarchy in action. Go check it out, enjoy, and subscribe to both this channel and to that one. And that's it. That's the video. The infamous video on fascism, or as sometimes I would call it, the fascist video. I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed. I'm not done recording it. That's actually just the first part out of like 6. The script is like 15,000 words. I've only done 5,000 words so far in recording, so I'm not done. But to you, I am. So I'd like to thank you for watching this whole thing. I'd like to thank, hold on. There's someone who recognized me. Their name was, I think it was Gnome? Yeah. Their name was Gnome. Gnome from St. John's in New Brunswick. Saw me at the Anarchist Library. Hello, Gnome. Everyone in the comments say hello to Gnome if you got this far. I feel like a lot of people might be less in this conclusion of the video, just because the video is so long. Anyway, thank you, Gnome. Hello. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking. That's not just for Gnome, that's for everyone. Thank you for liking. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for leaving comments, letting me know what you think. Thank you for being patrons, to all the patrons who support me and allow me to work on videos that are a bit longer, a bit bigger, who take more effort and more research and all that, where I don't need to publish videos every single week to work on this kind of video. That's because of patrons. Thank you, patrons. There's Roman Brandel, X-Towns, Bone Meal, and Chrissy Chris, who are the top tier patrons who I cannot thank enough for helping out with the channel. I can finish by telling you how long and why it took so long to make this video. It took me a year and a half to make this video, mostly because I didn't know how to make it and how to talk about fascism. There's plenty of ways in which you can talk about fascism. I decided to go with the characteristics route, and I feel like I didn't go through all characteristics that I could have. I didn't talk about Benjamin and the aestheticization of politics, mostly because I can't say aestheticization. So that we left that apart. There's a lot of things I could have targeted. Could have went more, like I said, into the history of Hitler and Mussolini. Maybe go into fascism more today instead of like historic fascism or like and all that. The more I read books, the more it confused me. I thought it would help, but then I kept reading books, articles, zines, and it would just confuse me more because then I had an overload of information to share. So I synthesized as much as I could. I did my best. I hope you enjoyed. I did. I really enjoyed not only making this video in the past year and a half. Also, things changed during that year and a half. Keep in mind, when I started making this video, Trump's second term didn't start. That's crazy to think about. So all of this has been one hell of a ride. But I'm more motivated than ever to make that video on anti-fascism. And I'll be most motivated to make that video on anti-fascism if this video does good. So share it. Talk about it. Say, hey, do you know what fascism is? Can you explain it to me? And then people will go like, I don't really know. And then you're like, I have a video for you. That's the propaganda that we're going to go for. Okay. So go out, go see your friends and tell them that, they don't know fascism as well as you do. And then refer them to this video. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And check out my Instagram. I sometimes post really funny stories on Instagram of comments, and Letterboxd, of course, all the movies I watch, I log them on there, and I've been watching really good movies. I have great movie selection. You should check it out. And I think that's it. I think that's all the plugging I need to do. Anarchist FAQ, obviously. That's it. All right. Goodbye.